Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dominic Ziegler. I write the Economist's weekly Banyan column on all things to do with Asia. This session is going to be on small island developing states, and President Whipps really laid out in fairly stark terms how climate change is having an impact now on coastal ecosystems and on populations of small islands. And we're going to explore in this session with some very esteemed panelists some of the implications and some of the solutions in terms of how vulnerable nations and citizens can protect themselves from climate change that's brought about by forces taking place elsewhere on the planet. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our panelists, two of whom join us via video. Neha Mehta, who's from the UN Capital Development Fund, and Alpana Pratap, she's from the Pacific Islands Development Forum, both online. You're very welcome indeed. And here in the room, Stuart Minchin of the Pacific Community, and Atsushi Tsunami, head of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Let's start with a little bit of democracy, if I may. You have these paddles on your seats or behind you or under you, and I'd love to ask you about a theme that I think really hangs over this session and much of the summit here, and that's decisions that were reached at Sharm el-Sheikh, and in particular the notion that rich countries should pay for the damage caused to poor ones or to vulnerable ones, so loss and damage, which effectively is on the sort of polluter pays principle. That's perhaps the most notable development of the climate summit. But another one is the call for new rules, new thinking, new mechanisms to finance the damage caused to poorer countries. So I guess my question to you fairly bluntly is, do you believe that the loss and damage agreement amounts to much? Do you think that nations that have committed to this will follow through on their commitments? We might even take a vote at the end of the session as well to see whether our panelists have changed or shifted the dial on your views. But so those who believe that this is significant and that the global community can follow through on this, please vote yes. Those skeptics amongst you, vote no. Oh, well, we've had it looked sort of 50-50 for the first couple of seconds, but no, it's an emphatic no, perhaps sort of 70-30, would you say?
Yes.
So thank you. Alpana, I'd like to start with you on this topic of loss and damage, and your sort of conclusions, please, coming out of the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Summit. What does it mean to you? How hopeful are you? And what do you think are the implications and next steps?
Thank you. From my perspective and from the Pacific perspective, this loss and damage issue is very, very prominent in the Pacific. And as you may know, that the Pacific Island countries are quite vulnerable to the effects of the climate change. And some of these countries, the elevation maximum is 3 to 5 meters. So it is quite vulnerable to the sea level rise and to the impact of climate change. So I think it is very important that this is followed through. And as you may know also that Pacific Island countries are quite they provide the leadership and they progress and lead in the negotiation on climate change at the global arena. So I think it is upon the leaders of the Pacific to continue to push for these issues to be addressed. And I think these COP platforms are quite effective for these kind of negotiations and progress in terms of addressing effects of the climate change.
Thank you, Arpana. Neha, I'd love to turn to you. You're a legal and a financial specialist too, so wearing those two hats, what are the next steps in terms of making any loss and damage agreement reality and practically effective?
Bula Vinaka, thank you, Dominic, for having me. It's a pleasure to be dialing in today. It's a pity I couldn't make it in person. Very happy to be joining this esteemed group of panelists. So thanks for the question, Dominic. And like Arpana said, Pacific Islands, the SIDS, are the hotspot for natural disasters. And until 2000s, we had just about 10 major disasters every year. And now, fast forward 2 decades later, we almost have 20 major disasters every year in SIDS. So we are talking about a problem which is real, and climate problem is the ocean crisis, and it's also a human crisis. So what's coming out of the COP27, I think is very interesting because we're looking at the possibility. We are also looking at the danger, but I would like to focus on the possibility because when we talk about possibility, we are looking at how we can ideate, how we can innovate, how we can make all our solutions inclusive and make sure we leave no one behind. Because when I wear the hat of working for the UNCDF, the intent is to bring the private and the public capital and to make sure that we leave no one behind and make a system which is more inclusive and communities which are climate resilient. So there is certainly a lot of coherence in terms of how the climate mitigation should work out, especially through the Fifth Secretariat and the kind of initiatives we see coming out of our headquarters in Suva, Fiji as well. And I'm a bit skeptical as well, because I know that in 2019, the commitment to help the SIDS was actually just about 1.5 billion, when the total capital which was committed for climate change mitigation was about 100 billion. So we are talking about a big mismatch, and this is also indicative of the global capital market, which currently stands at 340 trillion, and only $25 trillion goes to the least developed countries, the LDCs, like we call it in the UN definition. So there is a big capital gap at all times, and I think it's about time that we walk the talk and we make sure that we look after the Pacific Islands, because Pacific is the largest ocean water in the world. It takes 3% of the Earth's surface. So we are talking about a problem which is real and which is happening as we speak.
Could I ask you to drill down a bit further on the financing aspect? Because perhaps the key other development out of Sharm el-Sheikh was the notion that there could be new frameworks and new financial thinking in terms of getting funds to countries that need it, either for mitigation or increasingly adaptation. There was the Bridgetown initiative put out by the Prime Minister of Barbados, and her recommendation was overhauling the IMF in ways that, for instance, would mean less attention paid to credit ratings of countries. There was also the Global Climate Mitigation Trust, which had some support, including from President Macron of France, that proposed using IMF special drawing rights. Just tell us a bit, more about your thoughts about the need for these kinds of mechanisms, and indeed, if you think there are risks to the approach, what are they?
Indeed, Dominic, because like I said, we don't want to be in a position where we're just doing blue washing, because a lot of talk has happened already. But just to put a spotlight in terms of what CDF is doing in the region, we have been working with the Fiji government to launch their first ever Fiji Blue Bonds. And the money that comes out of this blue bond will actually be supporting positive coral reef businesses, supporting sustainable fisheries and aquaculture and the marine life. So I truly feel that the work that we are doing is on the ground, and it really speaks to the problem that we see in the Pacific Islands, because we see firsthand that all the waste is going into waterways and oceans. And we need to find solutions. At the same time, we're looking at how we can come up with biofertilizers, and how we can bring blue shipping as well. This will be the first time that PG will have a ship which is going to run on hydrogen or a hybrid or electric mechanism. So I think we are looking at innovative solutions, because the last 2 years, the topic and the focus has been using tech as a force of good. So how can we bring technology to the forefront and really make sure that we can support businesses that are actually looking at creating sustainable communities? Because when we talk about the coral reefs being bleached and they support actually 1 billion population around the world, how can we make sure that we make this entire supply chain digitized or sustainable? So that every time you make an investment, it just doesn't stop at providing the funding. We're also providing technical assistance and grants, and making sure that right after the funding finishes, the business model is sustainable and the beneficiaries really understand the economic benefits of it, and they're sold to the idea and they can carry on running that project for years to come. So I think the sustainability angle is very important, and that's where we want to make sure that when we're talking about bringing everyone, leaving no one behind, it's the public-private partnership. So we're talking about blended finance, we're talking about catalytic investments, and a lot of thought needs to be put into how we can design those innovative financing solutions to really make sure it's enticing for the private sector.
Well, thank you very much. And Neha, you've raised a number of themes that I hope we can come back to, including kind of building sustainability into every initiative. But also, I suspect that if money does flow, there'll be issues of avoiding duplication, issues of coordinating money flows, and perhaps we can come back to those themes. But Stuart, could I turn to you now and just help us conceptualize small island states first, just in terms of understanding the challenges, and then I'd like to ask you about those challenges. We, us non-experts, or those of us who are not familiar with Pacific Islands, think of tiny little scraps of territory, and perhaps we think less about the very large ocean space around them that forms their exclusive economic zone. So as well as being small island states, they're large ocean states. Tell us a bit about the implications of conceiving these states in those terms, ocean as well as land.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Look, the Pacific is made up of 98% ocean and 2% land. On those those small islands, we have very small populations. So the big challenge in our region is actually the capacity to actually deliver and to absorb large amounts of climate finance. In many of our member governments, they may have a climate change ministry that has 4 or 5 people in it. So if you've only got 4 or 5 hands cranking the wheel, it's very difficult to deliver a program of development that might need to be in the billions of dollars in order to have the impact that's required. So a lot of global approaches to development and climate finance come in with a very, dare I say, European-centric view of the world, and the rules and constraints are set according to the paradigms that those countries are used to working in, where there's lots of human capital, where you've got plenty of people to help deliver, and they don't recognise the unique context of a region like the Pacific, or in fact the Caribbean, and the architectures that we've built over the years to deal with these challenges. So just give you two quick examples. It's quite common for rules to be set around the fiscal and financial responsibilities. You mentioned the credit ratings of countries, but it's as simple as saying they'll set rules like you cannot pay anyone who does not have a bank account. But many of our islands don't have banks, right? So no one has a bank account, right? So how do you actually implement a project in that case? We're required to follow procurement rules that require 3 quotes, above a certain level. If you've only got 1 boat that goes to that island, it's impossible to get 3 quotes. And so what happens is that we get these rules applied. We're told that we're not following the rules, so therefore you either have to pay the money back or you don't get the funding in the first place. So I have a team in SPC, the Pacific Community, that's helping member countries in the Pacific access that climate finance. But it's a huge, long, difficult process. As President Whipps said, the red tape is incredible. We hold the record for the fastest project under the Green Climate Fund in the Pacific Community in helping one of our countries get access to Green Climate Fund dollars. But it's a drip feed at the moment, and it needs to be a torrent. We really need to amp up the flow of this climate finance over 100-fold in order to meet just the commitments that have already been made to the Pacific, let alone what's needed to actually make the transition.
And in terms of amping up that finance, what's the balance between individual states negotiating and Pacific Island states negotiating collectively? And I ask you because you run an organisation that for decades has acted as a kind of mini UN for the region.
Yeah, well, look, we've been around for 75 years. We were developed to meet this challenge that the member countries can't develop all of these capabilities and capacities themselves. So they created these regional institutions, SPC and SPREP in the Pacific, and a bit like CARICOM in the Caribbean, that are the home for the capabilities that are shared by all of the countries in the region. So we are an accredited entity, for example, under the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. But we don't, these funds do not pay for the capacity to actually prepare countries to apply, or they will only pay for the countries themselves to build that capacity. And as I said, if you've only got 4 or 5 people in your country, you actually need a whole team of people supporting all of the countries in the region. And at the moment, many of the rules for these funds are just not enabling what's needed in terms of capability at a regional scale to support the bids. Not only the bids, but even if you're successful in getting the money, you've then got to implement the project, and that takes technical capability, project management, and a whole range of things that the countries don't have the ability to drive at this point. So they rely on institutions like ours that they own. We're an extension of them, we're governed by them, but they rely on the capability that we provide to actually help them progress and to access the funding, to progress the funding, and to actually deliver the projects on the ground. But there's a limitation, and that is that those funds won't pay for the regional capabilities. They'll only give money individually to the countries.
Thanks, Stuart. At Sushir, Japan is a major official donor in the Asia Pacific. The Sasakawa Peace Foundation is very active across the region. You've followed events at the Climate Summit, and you've heard your fellow panelists. I'd love to ask you, what your reflections are, what Japan can do both at an official and at a foundation level. I mean, first of all, will Japan commit unambiguously, in your view, and I stress, you are not a government official, but what is your sense? Will Japan commit in a big and wholehearted way, for instance, to loss and damage? But also, what else can Japanese institutions do?
Thanks, Dom. For the loss and damage, of course, I'm sure that the Japanese government will contribute as much as they can and be supportive to the idea and the fund itself. But I just wanted to sort of follow up on what President Whips was saying earlier, and as Stuart was just mentioning, how from the point of view of small Pacific, small island states, having huge multinational funds like this, I mean, it's helpful and whatever. But the important thing is, I think, the speed and flexibility. And I think some of the work that we do, along with the Nippon Foundation and ourselves and the South Korea Peace Foundation in this area, is that the project doesn't have to be huge, but it's more bits and bits, but needed to be done right now. I mean, people are suffering, and they're thinking of as the President Whips was saying something about the hospital, for instance. It could happen any time, and we need a plan to do what he was saying that needs to be done, and that you cannot wait for 2-3 more years doing feasibility studies and applying for the all these things. So as a private foundation that we have that worked for years in this area, we feel more like what we need to be doing more, rather than, oh, that's great, this new fund is now available. Our role may be shifting to something else. No. I think we have more to do actually. And also, we are working with the government, Palau, or other governments, and in particular, but to help them to devise this plan, for instance, to apply, as Stuart was saying, that they need a capacity to actually get access to this fund and has to implement this fund, and to have an actual plan for the long-term as well as the short-term ones, and more flexible ones, and so on and so forth. So I think not like something like our foundation or other foundations across the world that are working in this area, and that, like Stuart Institute, that can work together to make sure that they have access to this fund, or be more, utilize this fund for whatever they need to be doing. And I think speed and flexibility is a challenge that we'll see as we see operationalizing this loss and damage.
Thank you. And while you were talking, you raised in my mind the issue that it's the elephant that stomps around the room of geopolitics and US-China rivalry, because you said things, can't wait, they have to be done now. But I've heard from both American officials and Chinese officials that they are ready to help. Yet the rivalry that plays out among small island states perhaps is welcome in some ways in terms of funds being offered and attention being paid. But I also sense that it involves a degree of discomfort from island states themselves. And I wonder who would like to comment on that, because in official forums, that often gets swept under the carpet, and we're not official, so we can talk about it. Stuart.
Well, I won't talk in detail on the geopolitics per se. What I would say is there are a lot of commitments and promises to help, and a lot of goodwill to help the region. But many of those, much of that goodwill does not translate into being willing to use the existing mechanisms that the countries have in place. People want to come in and develop a whole new process, and this is quite common for many of the larger donor countries around the world. They want to apply their own rules, their own project management approaches, and in many cases bring their own people and actually bring them in to do the work. And that doesn't leave any capacity in the Pacific to, when those projects are gone, you've got to keep them running. You've got to maintain them. So they've got to, you've got to build capacity within the region itself rather than fly in, fly out support.
I'm going to ask Arpana and Neha in a minute their views on this topic. But if I could just ask a quick follow-up. Is part of the concern that these big donors come in perhaps for sort of geopolitical reasons to sort of fight a fight which isn't the fight of local states, of smaller states, and then they might leave? Is part of the concern the longer-term commitment?
Well, that's certainly part of it. What I would say is that our leaders in the region are very sophisticated in how they are levering this interest to ensure that there's long-term commitment into the region. So, I think we shouldn't look at the Pacific states as being victims in all of this. They're actually very active and very, very clever in the way that they're interacting and levering off this interest. But what I would say is that there's this real need to not reinvent the wheel and to work with the existing frameworks that the Pacific leaders have put in place, rather than trying to come in and set up a whole new multilateral or regional approach to driving this funding. And it's critical. I was at the Pacific Forum Leaders meeting in August, and almost every country identified that they're hurting at the moment, as President Whipps said, with the fuel prices from the Ukraine crisis. Almost 30% of some countries' GDP is being spent just to keep the diesel generators running so that people have power. 30% of their GDP, and it's not been a priority for the world to assist the Pacific to transition there to renewable energies, because they're such a small component of the mitigation problem globally. But if you add mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage and the development constraints this is putting on, it actually raises the priority of this to a much higher level. And there's real urgency to act, and it's going to take billions and billions and billions of dollars to make that transition. And at the moment, there's tens of millions being provided per year.
Arpana, would you like to just respond to what you've heard in particular from Stuart? Perhaps around the caution against reinventing the wheel so far as big donors and their own processes is concerned.
Thank you. I agree with him in the sense that from my experience working in the Pacific, I have seen that most of the donors have different requirements. And even to the point, the reporting requirements is quite complex. And working in the Pacific, I have seen that most of the Pacific Island countries struggle to even develop proposals for this big funding. They have a lack of capacity to seek this kind of funding. There are many organizations in the Pacific that assist the communities and the countries to have access to this funding. However, this is sometimes this is where it stops. There's no sustainability when it comes to project management, and people have. The projects do not see, like after project, even to the monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring is an issue in the Pacific. So for the Pacific, I'm happy to say that it attracts a lot of donors, a lot of funding. However, there's a lack of coordination nationally as well as regionally. To have more effective solution to address the issues of the climate change. So I feel that the funding is there, and even in terms of geopolitics, I would want to mention is that for the Pacific, it's not important who the donor is, as long as we are able to progress the work. So it is not that complicated at the moment. But these issues that exist is a lack of capacity for the Pacific Island countries to access the fund, and as well as the lengthy reporting processes. So a lot of time goes into this administration work and not on the actual groundwork. Nowadays, I've also seen that the donors are focusing mostly on the community level resilient work. So that's a positive progress in this case.
Thanks very much. And if I could ask you to quickly jump in here with any thoughts and observations from you in terms of the approach that donors can and should take.
Yeah, thanks. I think I will agree with what Stuart has to say regarding sustainability, because most of the times when we run a project, what happens when the funding is coming to an end and we don't really have funding coming our way. But at the same time, we do see a lot of interest from around the world, and it's important to also identify what is the intent when the capital is being placed, because we have to be aware of the fact that the development financial institutions don't really have enough capital, because the institution investors have around 900% more capital than the DFIs. And something that really speaks to the problems of the Pacific Island is the fact that a lot of these countries don't have a central bank. So we are talking about a country like Nauru with a population of 10,000 people and just about 21-kilometer geographical area. So you cannot really begin to start making a project there, because like Stuart said, there's no team. And then at the same time, how do you run these projects and make sure that they run over a course of 5 years' time, because they need to be sustainable as well. So that is the key issue, because we are looking at money coming in, but can we really make sure that the sustainability angle is there? That's key. And apart from that, I think something that has not been touched, and it is a bit off topic, is the fact that when we talk about natural disasters, around 80% of the people who are displaced are women after the natural disasters, and they face a lot of gender violence. And not enough has been done in that area. So I think it's equally important that when we engage with the donors, we need to identify the key themes and speak of projects which really are going to help the last mile.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that time is pressing, and I'm keen to throw open questions to the floor. There are themes that we may not have time to explore in depth. One is coastal resilience. But I just would like to remind you that we have a small island developing states roundtable lunch, which will be dealing very much with the sort of the how in terms of mitigation, but in particular adaptation. So perhaps that's where the discussion on coastal resilience can take place. I'm keen that we do dive into the ocean dimension of small island states. But I'd like to ask you all for questions, and particularly for ocean-related ones, if you have them. One of the big themes is, of course, migratory fish and the movement of those fish because of climate change. Any questions here? And particularly if we have any participants from Pacific Islands. The lady in the fourth row there.
Thank you. Jazz Chambers from Ocean Decade Australia. Nice to see you up there, Stuart. A question just about the move by the Tuvalu government to digitise their nation. I'm just interested in comments from the panel on your thoughts on that. How does a country remain a country underwater?
Stuart, why didn't you address that?
Okay, great. I think this is a really innovative interest from Tuvalu. They are facing the reality of a country that is going to disappear under the current climate scenarios. So how do they capture the richness of their culture, their land, so that future generations can actually know what home looked like, and it's something that SPC is very engaged with, because we don't only look after oceans and climate, we also are the home of the Pacific Arts and Culture Festival. We custodians of some Pacific language and cultural information. We deal with human rights and social development in the region. So we're like a mini UN, and it covers these issues. So we're keen to support Tuvalu in that process. They are very actively looking not just at capturing digitally, but where they would relocate to as a country when that eventuality does occur. I think that there are opportunities too in our region with digitisation more generally. I recall some work that was done between Microsoft and Indigenous Australians to tell the stories through augmented reality postcards, for example, and to capture those kind of traditional cultural gems, if you like, in the digital domain. So I think that's going to be a real focus for the next little while. SPC's governance annual governance meeting with all of the countries happened last week in Vanuatu, but next year it's happening in Tuvalu. So we'll be doing a lot of work with them over the next year in helping them progress in that project.
Well, that's a really fascinating and pressing initiative, and it raises another question to do with EEZ claims around territory that sinks below the waters. And I wonder, has there been a debate about this and what the state of the debate is, particularly in terms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and what states should do?
Yeah, so certainly we in the Pacific community provide, if you like, the technical expertise to help countries with delimiting their maritime boundaries. We've been very active in the Pacific in helping the member countries with defining their maritime boundaries and putting the cases up to UNCLOS, UN Law of the Sea. And the reason behind that is because many of the definitions of those boundaries are defined by, in some cases, small islands, sand islands and atolls that actually define the exclusive economic zone. And many of those features will be underwater in future, and the current definition-based approach that the UN takes would mean that if we were to resurvey those at that time, that could be risk that those exclusive economic zones would be smaller. So the intent from the Pacific leaders is to define their boundaries, to define them in hard lines on the map, so to speak, so that even if those features that are currently used to define those boundaries change due to sea level rise, the Pacific is saying to the world, we will maintain these boundaries because it's not our fault that those features are disappearing, it's your fault, right? And this is a general theme, I'd say, both on climate finance and in things like maritime boundaries. It seems that it is, if I use an analogy, it's the criminals setting the rules as to what the compensation will be, right? It's the countries that are polluting that are defining the rules for the climate finance. In a broader sense, it's the polluting countries that are causing these issues. So the Pacific should not be dealing with the consequences and losing their domains because of that.
Would you like to respond to that or to anything else that you've heard?
Well, just quick points about the geopolitics. I think that was a very important question that you raised. And I think if things like the free, open Indo-Pacific strategy keeps the United States and Japan or Australia to be more pay attention to this small Pacific small island states, that's great. But this regional rivalry shouldn't really, take over the important question of the global challenge, which is, this is what we're talking about here, right? And One example is that my foundation actually holding an international conference on the Arctic, just because actually next year, just because the Arctic Council is not operating because of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the dialogue just stopped. And we need something to keep it going, because the Arctic is really changing so fast that we beyond our imagination now, that would affect completely, directly to the sea level rise and all the things that we're talking about here in the Pacific. So it's a global challenge, not the regional, all the thing. So this is the whole thing has to be put together. And also we are also doing the Women, Peace and Security with the United Nations. And the natural disaster issue, that maybe there is a point about the role of women in all of this is also very important, and it cannot be sort of held back. And those kind of global agendas has to be all put together when discussing the issues of SIDS. And I think regional geopolitics should really be affecting it. And I think positively that's fine, but we need to keep in this as a global challenge.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. The gentleman on the edge there.
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow on from the questions around the boundaries. And there's a sort of talk of defining the blue Pacific continent from the combination of those EEZs in the Pacific. But there's quite a few high seas areas in there. So what's the potential for joint management, turning them into high seas MPAs and so on? Or what are the ideas around the blue Pacific continent and how you deal with those high seas areas?
Neha or Arpana, would you like to answer that question or address it? Would you raise your hand if you would like to? Maybe our connection is not good. Stuart, I'm going to turn to you.
Great. The concept of the blue Pacific continent is really a communication to let the rest of the world know that these are not acting as individual countries; they are acting regionally. A great example. You mentioned the high seas component. We did a study of the tuna issues, and you mentioned this, Dominic. Looking at what the impact of climate change is going to be on tuna distribution within the region. And under future climate scenarios, it looks like the tuna will move more towards the eastern side of the Pacific, towards the east. That will move much of the tuna stock out of EEZ waters of some key countries where tuna makes up to 50% of their GDP. And move it into high seas where it becomes exposed to fishing, unregulated fishing by other countries that can access those high seas waters. So this is one example of where the loss and damage issue becomes a really key one. If you're losing 50% of your GDP as a country because of the impact of climate change, there's real need to address that. So the Pacific countries are working very closely together to ensure that they make these cases more broadly to the rest of the world. And there's even some work going on with the International Court of Justice led by Vanuatu to take some of these cases more broadly from the region to the global community. So it's great that the global community has started at least acknowledging that there is a loss and damage issue, because for many years that's fallen on deaf ears. But there's a long way to go, and time is short, as we've heard. We need to act now to protect these issues in the longer term. What I can tell you is that the Pacific works very well together. They are a cohesive unit when it comes to advocating on a global stage for these issues of climate change and oceans. You've never seen a closer group of leaders agreeing totally on the challenge and the direction that has to go within the region. So I think the Pacific will continue to be very effective at advocating for these issues on a global front.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, thanks to our panelists this morning, I feel that we've covered a lot of ground in terms of laying out the challenges for small island states. Everything from adapting to climate change to, really deep and important notions about protecting culture, including through digital means, and also about the challenges of getting the right aid and financial help in the right fashion. We obviously haven't had time to go in depth into everything, but as I say, we have a lunchtime roundtable where we can explore these themes in more detail. There's been a call for dialogue. Let's take this conversation out to the rest of the day, and I'd like to ask you now, please, to join me in thanking our fantastic panelists, Arpana, Neha, Stuart, and Atsushi. So thank you very much indeed, all of you.